In the winter of 1933, Germany was a country collapsing inward. Its economy was shattered, unemployment was suffocating, and the political system was falling apart under the strain of extremist movements hungry for dominance. The Weimar Republic, once a fragile experiment in democracy, now trembled under pressure from the far right and the far left, each convinced that only they could rescue the nation from humiliation and chaos. Amid this darkness rose a charismatic agitator whose voice dripped with fury and promise. His rallies grew into storms. His rhetoric crushed nuance beneath the boots of absolute conviction. Many Germans, exhausted by despair, began to believe that he alone could restore their pride. On January 30, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. It was a moment that would divide the century, for his rise opened the door to a chain of events that would drag the world into a conflict more savage than anything humanity had ever known. For the first months of 1933, his power was not yet absolute. He maneuvered, schemed, and coerced his way toward control, using fear and fire to tear down what remained of Germany's democratic institutions. His ascent accelerated after the Reichstag fire in February, when he seized upon the crisis to push through emergency powers that silenced opposition, crippled civil liberties, and began transforming Germany into a totalitarian state. Yet even as he consolidated control, his position was not invulnerable. Rival factions watched him with suspicion. Elements within the military distrusted him. Foreign powers underestimated him. Germany still hovered on a knife's edge, and a single disruption in this critical year could have upended everything that followed. The world remembers the path that history ultimately took toward dictatorship, rearmament, conquest, and genocide. But this trajectory was not inevitable. It depended not just on ideology and institutions, but on the survival of a single man at a pivotal moment. But what if this moment had gone differently? History didn't end. It just went elsewhere. Let us step into an alternate 1933 Germany, still fragile, still aching, still searching for a savior or a scapegoat. In this timeline, the divergence arrives not from a conspiracy, a coup, or a foreign intervention, but from something almost mundane: human mortality's ruthless unpredictability. In early March 1933, tensions inside the Nazi hierarchy were simmering. Hitler traveled frequently, often in open cars, often moving between rallies and strategy sessions with an exhausting pace. His health, already strained by years of stress, poor diet, and reliance on stimulants, wavered. Historical records hint that he suffered from chronic stomach issues and bouts of severe exhaustion even in the early 1930s. In our timeline, he powered through them. In this alternate one, he doesn't. On March 4, 1933, 2 days before the final vote that would grant him sweeping emergency powers, Hitler collapses from acute gastric bleeding, triggered by stress and fatigue. His entourage panics. Medical help arrives too late. Within hours before dawn breaks over Berlin, Adolf Hitler is dead. What follows is chaos, not immediately across the country, but within the Nazi leadership itself. Without its central figure, the Nazi Party instantly fractures. Hermann Göring seeks to seize control, hoping to rally the Sturmabteilung SA and sympathetic police units to maintain momentum. Joseph Goebbels, the master propagandist, tries to cloak the event in secrecy while crafting a narrative of martyrdom. Yet neither man commands universal loyalty. The army, already wary of Hitler's radicalism, sees an opening. President Paul von Hindenburg, old but still holding constitutional authority, views the Nazi movement now as weakened and destabilizing. He refuses to appoint Göring as chancellor. Instead, he empowers conservative forces to regain control, reversing the emergency decrees that Hitler had engineered and setting Germany on a path back toward limited parliamentary rule. The Nazis, robbed of their central icon, implode. They remain a party of anger, but not a party of destiny. Their momentum evaporates. The Reichstag, fire still fresh in the nation's memory, no longer becomes a springboard for total authoritarianism, but a cautionary tale of extremism. The Enabling Act fails to pass. Mass arrests of political opponents cease. The machinery of dictatorship, half-built, collapses back into dust. No Third Reich, no Hitler-led expansion, no lightning chain of invasions, and the world, suddenly released from the gravitational pull of fascism's most powerful prophet, begins drifting toward a radically different future. The first 5 years after Hitler's sudden death are defined not by war, but but by a frantic attempt to restabilize a nation that had nearly plunged into authoritarian darkness. The initial shock strikes the Nazi Party itself. Without Hitler's personal magnetism, its factions turn cannibalistic. Ernst Röhm attempts to mobilize the SAA, the paramilitary force of street brawlers who once terrified German cities, but without Hitler's influence over both the SA and the army, Röhm becomes isolated. The conservative establishment, emboldened by military backing, moves decisively to neutralize the SAS threat. Röhm is arrested, the organization dismantled, and its members absorbed into state police or dispersed entirely. Germany's political climate begins shifting away from extremism. The Social Democrats, long assaulted by Nazi propaganda, regain a foothold. The Catholic Center Party, traditionally a stabilizing force, pushes to restore constitutional norms. The Communist Party remains fractured but no longer hunted. A fragile coalition emerges, not strong enough to transform Germany overnight, but sufficient to stop its descent into dictatorship. Internationally, the absence of Hitler alters Europe's balance of fear. France and Britain no longer feel the same urgency to rearm, though they watch Germany warily, unsure whether new extremists might arise. The Soviet Union, having seen Hitler as a future adversary, temporarily redirects its strategic focus inward, accelerating industrialization but slowing military mobilization. Italy's Mussolini, robbed of a partner in fascist ideology, recalibrates his ambitions and avoids the reckless adventurism that led to his later downfall. Economically, Germany struggles but stabilizes slowly. Without Hitler's obsession with government spending shifts back toward public works under conservative and centrist influence. Unemployment declines gradually rather than dramatically. The psychological shockwave that authoritarian movements rely on begins dissipating. But the most immediate shockwave ripples through the German people themselves. The symbolism of Hitler's sudden death destabilizes the myth of national rebirth through extremism. Many who once flirted with radical solutions now recoil, seeing the fragility of authoritarian salvation. The country begins leaning in easily, imperfectly back toward democratic norms, though bitterness and nationalism remain potent. Foreign alliances also bend under the new gravitational landscape. Japan, having considered Germany a potential ideological partner, turns its attention fully toward its imperial ambitions in Asia without expecting European alignment. That means its eventual conflict with Western powers unfolds without the Axis scaffolding that once supported it. The absence of Hitler does not eliminate fascism across Europe, but it deprives the movement of its most powerful exemplar. Far-right groups lose their anti-Semitism remains tragically widespread. But without the machinery of a genocidal state, its horrors do not reach industrial scale. By 1938, Europe is tense but not armed for apocalypse. Germany remains resentful but not predatory. The Treaty of Versailles is still hated, but no leader emerges charismatic or ruthless enough to harness that hatred into conquest. The continent stands on uncertain ground but not yet on the brink of global war. The absence of Hitler reverberates through the mid-20th century, reshaping Germany's internal evolution and the geopolitical architecture of the entire world. Germany's national transformation begins slowly, almost cautiously. The Weimar Republic's revival is imperfect. Corruption persists. Extremist rhetoric survives in pockets, and old wounds refuse to heal fully. Yet the violence that consumed the actual 1930s never materializes. Jewish communities, though still facing prejudice, retain citizenship, businesses, and institutions. Intellectual life, rather than being gutted by purges, continues to thrive, allowing German universities to remain global centers of research and philosophy. By the 1940s, Germany becomes a nation defined by its contradictions, economically ambitious but politically fragmented, culturally vibrant, yet weighed down by the humiliation of Versailles. Attempts to renegotiate treaty terms occur through diplomacy rather than conquest. The military, now firmly under conservative control, resists any civilian attempts to push for aggressive expansion. Having seen how close Germany once came to being hijacked by extremism, Europe's regional power dynamics shift subtly. Without German aggression, Austria remains independent. Czechoslovakia endures. Poland becomes a regional leader in Eastern Europe rather than the flashpoint of a global conflict. The absence of war prevents the Soviet Union from expanding westward. Eastern Europe develops as a patchwork of democracies, authoritarian regimes, and unstable coalitions, but not as the Iron Curtain that once carved the continent in two religions. Role in Europe evolves differently. The Catholic Church, never forced to confront the moral catastrophes of Nazism, maintains stronger influence in Germany and Austria. The Protestant churches, not co-opted by a fascist state, remain politically engaged and socially active. The spiritual crisis that war once unleashed never becomes a generational wound. Culture also diverges. Without the trauma of total war, European cinema, literature, and philosophy turn less toward existential despair and more toward debates about modernity, industrialization, and the boundaries of democracy. German artists who once fled Einstein, Brechtmann, and many others remain in Europe, shaping an intellectual landscape richer and more diverse than in our world. Technology and science advance along a distinctly different path. Without the Nazi purge of Jewish scientists and dissenting intellectuals, Germany retains a formidable research base. The United States still attracts talent, but the brain drain is far smaller. The nuclear race accelerates more slowly. Without the Manhattan Project's urgency, nuclear fission remains largely experimental until the early 1950s. The Soviet Union's ambitions in this arena also slow, lacking the defensive paranoia triggered by rising fascism. The global order redefines itself around new poles of power. The United States remains ascendant, but not as the leader of a wartime alliance. Britain maintains its empire slightly longer, not drained by global conflict. The Soviet Union industrializes, but never becomes a superpower. Without Nazi invasion, Stalin's militarization remains incomplete. Decolonization unfolds gradually, but lacks the moral urgency fueled by the horrors of fascism and global war. Asia becomes the central arena of conflict instead. Japan, unchecked by Germany's parallel ambitions, continues its imperial expansion into China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Its confrontation with the United States becomes inevitable, leading to a vast Pacific War fought in isolation from Europe. The conflict is brutal, but the absence of simultaneous war in Europe prevents it from escalating into a global catastrophe. The atomic bomb developed later may or may not be used, depending on the timeline's evolving pressures. The Cold War, as we know it, never emerges. Instead, the world settles into a multipolar balancing act, the United States and Britain on one side, the Soviet Union as a regional force, Japan carving an empire in Asia, and Germany cautiously rebuilding its dignity without militarism. By the 1960s and 70s, Europe becomes a competitive bloc of industrial democracies, cooperating economically, but without the violent trauma that once united them in fear of repeating the past. The European Union may still form, but as an economic alliance rather than a peace project. And through all these decades, the shadows of the atrocities that defined our world genocide, mechanized extermination, total war, ever materialize. The scars of the 20th century are less deep, though new wounds, unfamiliar to us, take their place. By the dawn of the 21st century, the world shaped by Hitler's early death is at once familiar and foreign, recognizable in structure, but altered in spirit. Europe stands as a mosaic rather than a monolith. Germany emerges as a leading industrial democracy, never divided, never occupied, never forced to confront the horror of crimes it never committed. It grows into a technological powerhouse, but without the moral responsibility that defined its post-war identity in our world. Nationalism remains an undercurrent, but not a weapon sharpened by genocide. France and Britain maintain greater global influence. Having preserved more of their resources and populations in the absence of a continental war, the British Empire dissolves more slowly. India still gains independence, but through more drawn-out negotiations rather than the urgent decolonization triggered by wartime exhaustion. The Soviet Union, never galvanized by existential conflict, becomes stagnant by the mid-20th century. Without the impetus of Cold War competition, technological progress slows. It remains authoritarian, but lacks the militaristic edge of our timeline. When it eventually fragments, it does so quietly, without the dramatic collapse that once shook the world in 1991. Japan, having established dominance in East Asia, becomes the primary global rival to the United States. Its empire persists longer, but eventually fractures under economic strain and resistance movements. The Pacific remains a tense ocean long after the mid-century wars, with regional powers like China, Korea, and a post-imperial Japan competing for influence. The United States still rises but differently. Without the rallying force of World War II, American global leadership develops more gradually. The economy grows, but the shared sacrifice of wartime unity never materializes. Civil rights movements still emerge, but without the wartime contradictions that once fueled them, they progress at a slower, uneven pace. Technology evolves in curious ways. Nuclear power exists, but arrives later and under tighter international caution. Computers develop faster in Germany and Britain, whose universities remain intact and competitive. The space race is slower and less dramatic. Without the Cold War, the moon landing may occur years or decades later, and perhaps not led by the United States. Global culture absorbs influences from a more multipolar world. Cinema is dominated not only by Hollywood, but by a powerful Japanese film industry and a thriving European one. Music, fashion, and literature emerge from a diverse constellation of centers rather than a single hegemonic hub. Daily life feels both recognizable and subtly divergent. The world is less traumatized, but also less united. Without a global fight against fascism, there is less collective memory of shared sacrifice. Without the United Nations emerging from the ashes of World War, international cooperation is thinner, more transactional. The most profound difference lies in moral consciousness. Without the Holocaust as history's starkest warning, humanity's understanding of genocide, racial hatred, and authoritarian danger evolves differently. Lessons are learned, but slowly, through scattered tragedies rather than one seismic horror. Hate remains, but its history is less clear, less universally condemned. This new world feels safer in some ways. No world war of unprecedented scale, no civilization-wide trauma, but more precarious in others. Humanity lacks the caution born from catastrophe. It walks forward confidently, sometimes blindly, without the shadows that once forced it to reflect. Every alternate timeline hides a price, and this one carries its own quiet burden. In a world without Hitler's war, the moral shock that once reshaped humanity never arrives. The global revulsion to genocide, totalitarianism, and racism, which in our timeline became the foundation of international law and human rights, fails to crystallize. Without the urgency born from horror, reform moves slowly. Authoritarian regimes survive longer. Racial hierarchies dissolve more unevenly. Refugees receive less sympathy. Borders become harder, not softer. Germany avoids its darkest crimes, but it also avoids its profound rebirth. Without being forced to confront guilt, the nation never undergoes the introspection that once became a model for democratic resilience. Its democracy remains functional but fragile, capable yet shallow, lacking the moral bedrock forged in the crucible of regret. Europe never experiences total war, but this means it never learns the necessity of unity. It grows without fully healing. Old rivalries linger. Integration proceeds cautiously, without the force of shared trauma to bind nations together. On the global scale, the absence of a Cold War sounds peaceful, but competition becomes subtler and more unpredictable. Without the structured tension of bipolar power, smaller conflicts proliferate. Proxy wars erupt not under ideological umbrellas but under raw competition for resources, influence, and regional dominance. And perhaps the deepest cost of all, humanity never learns what it nearly became. The abyss remains unseen, and therefore The dark potential of ideology, fanaticism, and hatred is never displayed in its full terror. People believe themselves safer than they truly are. The world avoids catastrophe, but also avoids wisdom. History is a fragile architecture of accidents, breath-held moments, and unanswered questions. It bends not only under the weight of great powers and ideologies, but under the flicker of life and death in a single human body. A heartbeat faltering in 1933 could have spared millions. It could have softened the century, but it would also have reshaped the lessons humanity carries in its bones. When we imagine alternate worlds, we do not escape our own rather. We illuminate it from the side, revealing its hidden edges and precarious foundations. The timeline we inhabit is neither inevitable nor ordained. It is merely the one that survived, the one that stumbled forward through horrors and triumphs, through unthinkable cruelty and remarkable resilience. In another world, the century is quieter, gentler, less shattered, but perhaps also less wise, less humbled, less aware of the darkness it must guard against. The past does not simply lie behind us. It shapes the air we breathe, the borders we cross, the freedoms we hold, the dangers we remember. Change a single life at a single moment, and everything shifts to our politics, our identities, our technologies, our very understanding of human nature. History didn't end. It just went elsewhere.